Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining. I am Sarah Sadian. I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy and Field Organizing with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. We're just going to give it a minute more for folks to join on the line, and then we can get started. Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. We'll get started now as folks are joining on the line. I am Sarah Sadian. I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy and Field Organizing with the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. This is our National HoUSed campaign call. As many of you know, the HoUSed campaign focuses on achieving anti-racist policies and achieving the large-scale sustained investments that are needed to ensure that renters with the lowest incomes have an affordable place to call home. We launched this campaign because we recognize that more than ever, we need bold policies to ensure that people with the lowest incomes and those who are most marginalized have an affordable, accessible home in communities of their choice. On the call, we have advocates from across the country, including homeless service and shelter providers, housing advocates, resident organizers and leaders, people with lived experience, including people experiencing homelessness or receiving or in need of federal assistance. We have philanthropy on the line, and we have media. So a large group of folks who've joined with us today. Before we get into the agenda, I want to remind folks that tomorrow is Election Day. So this is your nonpartisan reminder to go get out the vote, because we know that housing is won through ballots. We need folks, including tenants, to vote in elections to have their voice heard in Capitol Hill. I also want to remind folks that as we go through the agenda today, you can ask your questions into the Q&A box. After every speaker, we'll have some time to go through Q&A, but we probably won't be able to get to everything. Feel free, of course, to ask your questions, and we can follow up as needed. And as a reminder, we will share with everybody a copy of this PowerPoint presentation and all of the materials that our speakers mentioned in the coming days. So don't worry about getting the resources. We will get them to you. And with that, I will start with turning to Sarah Javed, who is from the National Women's Law Center, and it's going to speak about housing and economic insecurity among women and LGBTQ people of color. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. My name is Sarah Javed. I am a research fellow at the National Women's Law Center, and I use she, her pronouns. If you're familiar with any of the products that we've done in the past, we've been doing some fact sheets using the Census Household Pulse data. And this data is a survey that came out at the beginning of the pandemic to try to measure the economic and social impacts of the pandemic. And so we've been using this data to kind of highlight some things that have been going on during the pandemic. And so today I'm going to talk about kind of some of that data, the housing and food data specifically. And everything I want to talk about today is really focused on women of color, disabled women of color, and LGBT people of color. I say LGBT because the data is specifically from lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender individuals. And so on the next slide here, you'll see that we start out our analysis talking about home ownership and looking at the share of people who rent their homes rather than own their homes. And we've done this analysis by single adults to really try to isolate some of those disparities. And so in this chart, you can see that Black non-Hispanic women and Latinas are especially likely to be renting their homes versus owning their homes in comparison to white non-Hispanic men and women. And you can see this is true among disabled women and LGBT adults as well. And so some of the things that I want to really highlight today as I go through this data are some of the intersecting identities. And in these blue bars, you can see that we've chosen some really specific comparison groups. So we've chosen these groups to really be able to demonstrate the disparity for, not only by disability status and LGBT status, but also by race and by gender where we can, because when we use these overlapping identities and we do kind of this extensive breakdown of our data, we see some pretty significant disparities. And so here you can see that compared to non-disabled white non-Hispanic men, disabled Black non-Hispanic women are nearly 2 times more likely to rent their homes instead of owning their homes. And you can see that that's similarly true among LGBT Black non-Hispanic adults in comparison to non-LGBT white non-Hispanic adults. And then where we can in this brief, we did like a further breakdown for transgender individuals. And so you can see here that there is a sizable disparity among transgender adults of color in comparison to non-transgender white non-Hispanic adults. And so on the next slide, I'll start talking about some folks who are behind in their rent. So you're welcome to go forward. Thank you. So if you're familiar with any of our pulse analyses, we often look into those who are behind in their rent and behind on their mortgage payments throughout the pandemic. But this brief really did a much further deep dive into this data, and we explore a lot more populations. And so that's what I want to share with you here. So, again, kind of looking at these blue bars in comparison to the groups that I point out, I want to really highlight these disparities. So Black non-Hispanic women are about 3 times more likely than white non-Hispanic men to be behind on their rent. But among disabled Black non-Hispanic women, they're about 5 times more likely in comparison to non-disabled white non-Hispanic men to be behind on their rent. And then similarly, among LGBT adults of color, they're about 2 times more likely than both non-LGBT white non-Hispanic adults and LGBT white non-Hispanic adults. And so you can see here that a lot of these disparities are among race lines, which is why we've chosen to do our entire analysis kind of with these overlapping identities and these intersecting identities. And so the next slide, you'll see that we do, you see really similar patterns among those who are behind on their mortgage payments. And so you'll see that, again, Black women are over 3 times more likely than white non-Hispanic men to be behind on their mortgage payment. And then when we look at disabled women of color, so this was an area where just with data limitations, I wasn't able to do kind of like a full race breakdown. But I was still able to demonstrate, data for women of color and people of color. So disabled women of color were nearly 6 times more likely than non-disabled white non-Hispanic men to be behind on their mortgage payments. And so this is where we've chosen these comparison groups to really try to highlight these intersecting identities. And similarly for LGBT adults of color, they were over 3 times more likely than non-LGBT white non-Hispanic adults to be behind on their mortgage, and close to 3 times more likely than LGBT white non-Hispanic adults. And so, I've said it a lot already, I know, but kind of the purpose of this brief was really to be able to do a deep dive into these populations and to show these disparities. And so that's why I've highlighted these comparisons groups and really tried to show these disparities, and why overall numbers or average numbers don't often tell the full story. And when you break down this data by race, we often see that women of color, people of color are more likely to be dealing with housing insecurity and food insecurity. And so on the next slide, I'll finish up talking about emergency rental assistance data. So this chart is the share of people who applied for emergency rental assistance. And it's broken up by those who applied and received, and those who applied and were waiting or were denied. You can see here that Black women are especially likely to apply for emergency rental assistance. And then again, I want to bring your attention to some of these disparities and these comparison groups. So Black women were over 4 times more likely than white non-Hispanic men to apply for emergency rental assistance. And among disabled Black non-Hispanic women, they were over 7 times more likely than non-disabled white non-Hispanic men to apply for emergency rental assistance. And then you can see LGBT adults of color were also had a greater share who applied for emergency rental assistance in comparison to non-LGBT and LGBT white non-Hispanic adults. And so I hope that kind of what you've gained from this data that I've shared is really the importance of looking at these populations and these really detailed and extensive analyses. You often don't find data that's broken up like this and that's analyzed like this. And that's part of the reason why we do this at the Law Center, and part of the reason why I try to be so intentional about looking at these groups, and why we've come out with this specific housing brief when we do already have some pulse fact sheets. But those are some of the things that I really wanted to highlight. And I know I've gone through a little quickly through that data, but I really recommend checking out the brief. A lot of this data for these specific populations doesn't exist out there. And so it was really great to be able to highlight this in our brief. And our brief has a lot more information on housing insecurity and food insufficiency, and also talks about some utility data, and kind of really dives into how these groups have been harmed by racist, sexist, ableist, and anti-LGBTQ policies. So I will stop here, and I'm happy to answer any other questions, but I definitely recommend checking out the data in the brief.
Thank you so much. There are a bunch of questions, so we'll try to get to some of them. I wanted to ask a question about, you saw this big drop off between Black disabled women who applied for assistance at much higher rates, but were either many of them denied or were waiting for assistance. What does that tell you about barriers to assistance? Were applications too difficult for people to get through? Were there barriers within the programs themselves? Do you have any information about that, about why you saw such a big drop off there?
Yeah, so I think you've definitely just highlighted some of the things, and I apologize, I don't have too much information about the specific barriers, but I think that you're getting exactly there, that we're seeing that there's a much greater share among women of color, particularly Black non-Hispanic women, who are applied and either were waiting or were denied. And so you're definitely getting to something there. And I'm sorry that I don't have a better answer for you, but I think the data makes it clear that something is going on here, and that there are some barriers, there are some challenges to getting this rental assistance. And at the same time, it also shows us who is in most need of these resources.
Great. And Josephine asked a question about whether or not you also looked at households that have children living in the home as well, and what the outcomes were there too.
Yeah, so for this brief, we did not look at households with children. It was definitely something we thought about and we talked about, but this brief has just so much other data. And so we really wanted to kind of limit how much we're throwing at people at once. But looking at people in households with children, you definitely see that there are some higher rates of food insufficiency. And so in our normal household pulse fact sheets, which you can find on the Law Center's website, we do have some data specifically for households with children.
Wonderful, thanks for that. And I'm wondering if the National Women's Law Center, I think maybe this is going towards the question that was asked before, but Lisa has asked, what is being done to stop barriers that are preventing Black disabled women from having access or to emergency rental assistance? Or what are the sorts of solutions in general, maybe not for the specific program, that the National Women's Law Center is pointing to?
So I can tell you kind of really broadly, there's a focus on framing housing as a public good, not really, it's connected to so many other things, whether it's health, education, anything else. Housing has been connected to everything. And so there is really a push to treat housing like a public good so that we can benefit from it in that thinking. I'll apologize. I'm not a big policy person. I am definitely more on the research side, but I know the Law Center absolutely has resources on their website that will dive deeper into those questions.
That's okay. We don't expect you to know everything yet. We'll have Sarah Hasmer join on in the future too. I did want to ask, is this, I know this is from, I think, the Census Pulse Survey. Is that still happening? Is more data still coming out? Are you guys planning to track it going forward?
Yeah, so as far as I know, they have agreed to do this survey until October 2023. So we'll have about another year of data, and we definitely plan on continue to tracking it. So you'll see our fact sheets coming out. And as we kind of have been tracking this data, we've been looking at some different things, so we looked at the child tax credit for a good while and how that was being used. And especially when, that advanced credit was no longer being offered, we kind of showed how from the data how helpful it was. And so you'll see that as we go forward in the next year, some of the data will change a little bit, fact sheet from fact sheet, but we're definitely still going to analyze it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sarah, for joining. It was really important that we're hearing this data that you guys have been analyzing, and all of us reflecting about how we can address these disparities in the policy work that we do. So I appreciate you joining on and sharing with us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Next, we're going to turn to Eva Rosen from Georgetown University and Philip Garbodin from the University of Hawaii, who have done going to share with us two studies that they have done on landlord use of the threat of eviction and racial discrimination in tenant screenings. So I will turn it over to the two of you.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks for including us today on the call. So the work that Phil and I will be talking about today is from a project that we've been working on for a couple of years, looking at how landlords and their behaviors, their attitudes, how this impacts the lives of poor tenants and then shapes the low-income housing market more broadly. So we really look at a full range of different kinds of landlords, their business strategies, their tenant screening, as you mentioned, Sarah, and more specifically, their eviction practices. So more broadly, we're currently working on turning this research into a book, but today I want to tell you about just a couple of key findings related to how landlords approach eviction and eviction filing. And I do want to say a lot of this research is pre-pandemic, but I do think that it will provide some important, provides some important insights related to how property owners really operate more broadly, and that this can shed some light onto some of the dynamics that we've seen during the pandemic. So this is something maybe we can come back to during the Q&A. Next slide. So in our larger project, what we did to collect this data is that we conducted a number of what we call semi-structured interviews, so kind of free-flowing interviews, but that also all cover a certain range of topics, right? And we also conducted observations with a randomized sample of landlords and property managers in the following 4 cities. And these research sites were really selected to provide a range of different housing market contexts, certainly not the full range, but at the very least 4 different types of places. So we've got Baltimore, which is a poor city in a relatively wealthy metropolitan area. It's got an older housing stock and a declining population. We also went to Dallas, where poverty rates are actually surprisingly similar to Baltimore, but the economy is growing at a much faster rate. The housing stock is much newer, and it has a much larger portion of corporate professionalized landlords than in our other sites. Then we went to Cleveland. This is really our poorest city that we studied. It's also located within a poor metro area, so that's relevant. It has a declining housing stock and pretty high levels of racial segregation. And then lastly, DC has the lowest poverty rate of our sites, but it also has really high inequality with pockets of deep poverty located mostly in the southeast quadrant of the city. Next slide. So we did what we call heterogeneity sampling. In other words, we really wanted to capture the full range of landlords who were operating in the affordable housing market. So what we did is we pulled the sample by scraping rental property listings in all 4 of our cities. And to do this, we sampled from 2 places. So on the one hand, those who marketed their properties to unsubsidized renters, for example, through Craigslist. And then on the other hand, property owners who marketed to subsidized renters, for example, GoSection8.com or other sorts of sites like that. Importantly, we threw out any of the listings that were over 150% of fair market rent for that area, again, because we wanted to focus on the low-end rental market. So then we geocoded the listings, we matched them to census data on race and poverty. And from there, we pulled a random sample that was stratified by neighborhood racial composition and poverty rate. And then we actually just started making phone calls. Next slide. So we largely achieved our goal of capturing this wide range of the rental market, ranging all the way from really huge property managers who have hundreds of units. This was about 22% of our sample who owned over 100 units, all the way down to what lots of folks call mom and pop landlords, people who have really just 1 or 2 units. And across our papers, what you see is that this difference in size really matters a lot for the kinds of strategies that landlords use to interact with their tenants. I'll also just say that landlords and property managers who we spoke to were an incredibly diverse group of people. Around 40% were women, the majority were non-white, and that's sort of an important piece when you start to think about how race comes into play. Next slide. So our interviews were designed to be, as I said, open-ended, responsive. We discussed all aspects of the landlord's business strategy, as well as their personal histories. We conducted ethnographic observations as well with a subset of landlords. So we really watched them as they went about their day-to-day business. We spent time in housing court. We rode along with sheriff's deputies as they conducted evictions. We spoke with city officials and tenant advocates. We went to real estate auctions and investor association meetings, all kinds of things. We do also have some administrative data that accompanies the larger project, but I'm not going to focus on that today. Next slide. So just to give you a sense of the kinds of things we've published on this data, if you want more information that I can't give you in this very short presentation, we've explored how landlords become landlords in the first place, how they make investment decisions. We've looked at how they approach the eviction process, which I'll talk about in just a moment, how they screen tenants and the role that racial discrimination comes to play in that screening process. We've also considered how landlords engage with subsidized housing programs like housing vouchers. And then we've looked at the range of ways in which landlords manage their tenants and what it means more broadly that our system of housing depends so much on private landlords to provide this housing. Next slide. Okay, so what we really want to talk about today is the process of eviction filing, and specifically something called serial eviction filing. In other words, when landlords file on the same tenants in the same units repeatedly over a given period of time. Next slide. So initiating the first step in eviction by creating this legal filing actually serves to create a threat that aids in debt collection. So in one of our landlords, Arthur, he was in Cleveland, in his words, he said, well, if the tenants talk to us, if they work with us, make a payment plan or something or other, then we'll work with it. If they don't, then a court date would be applied for and they would have their day in court. And Arthur says that's the first warning shot across the bow. He explains once it reaches that stage, if they've got access to any funds or an agency or whatever, on the day of court, they'll come up with a wad of money saying, please don't put me through this. So in summary, for our landlords, filing for eviction lets their tenants know that they're serious about moving forward, and it often results in tenants then scrambling, for example, to their social networks or to an emergency rental assistance program to find the resources to pay. Next slide. And some landlords, and this is especially we found true for larger landlords, they really make the business of filing eviction paperwork kind of just a regular event each month. And they do so as soon as they're legally allowed to. So Liam, one of our Baltimore landlords, says it's every month like clockwork filing a notice. And then the thing about sending notices, there's this whole procedure, but then about 2 days before the eviction, and we get paid. And the only way we get paid is because of the threat of an eviction. So what Liam's sort of pointing to is the fact that landlords in our sample generally recognize that poor tenants have a number of competing financial demands, and the landlords are really recognizing the power of this filing to create a threat that puts pressure on the tenant to find a way to pay rent if they can. Next slide. Now, the small amounts of debt that low-income tenants often owe to their landlords, paradoxically also can come in handy when a landlord then maybe wants to get rid of their tenant for other reasons. Perhaps they want to upgrade the unit, perhaps they want to raise rent, or they've simply developed a personal animosity against their tenant. So one of our Cleveland landlords, again, explained, he says, I go down to the justice of the peace, let them find a judge and argue my case, and she argues her case, meaning his tenant. And you hope to get a good judge who understands the economics. The tenant is just not paying. No matter what goes wrong in the place, she has to pay, and then I can fix it. She's going to hold me accountable, but she still has to pay no matter what. But if you're 2 or 3 months behind and you're not paying nothing, that's a slam dunk case. In other words, he's saying that having a tenant who's late on rent means that the landlord can essentially evict that tenant who's been late whenever they want for whatever reason, as long as they've got that case documented. Now we've got another landlord, Charlie. It says Baltimore. It's supposed to say Dallas. My apologies. Charlie explains that if he doesn't like a tenant's behavior, attitude, or maybe even the company they keep, he'll find, quote, a legal reason to take care of it. And as it turns out, this is as easy as waiting for the tenant to be late on rent. And in the pool of tenants that Charlie is dealing with, this is a very common phenomenon. So he's actually got a lot of discretion in which tenants he keeps and which he doesn't. But pulling back from this example for a second, what I want to say is that what we find with this qualitative work overall is that eviction filings are usually made without the intent to actually remove the tenant. Eviction, as we well know, can be quite costly to the landlord in terms of turnover and vacancy. And so rather, these filings are meant to put pressure on the tenant, either to pay or to leave. And in fact, if you think about it, serial eviction filings would not really even exist as a phenomenon if they usually resulted in the removal of the tenant, because they would just be evictions in that case. There could be no additional filing at the same address. So Phil will show you in just a moment with the quantitative data how eviction filings and serial filings in particular are actually much more common in the lives of low-income renters than evictions themselves. The vast majority of eviction filings don't result in the tenant being removed. And of course, as we know, eviction filings themselves have negative consequences for tenants, whether or not they result in eviction. So I'll turn this over to Phil now, and he'll explore what this looks like in Washington, D.C.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Eva, for the handoff there. So as Eva said, we were interested in whether we could see these types of patterns of serial filings in actual administrative data on evictions. And the place where we have the best data from at the moment is in Washington, D.C. And we've actually, in another paper that Eva didn't mention, we've talked about just how different the sort of paper trail of evictions can be from place to place. So researchers doing eviction research in LA are going to have a very different sort of set of data than those at DC or Baltimore and so forth. But we do think that even though DC is just one case of many, that the sort of underlying social phenomenon that we're talking about should be relatively transferable site to site, although we're very interested in the national context here on this call. If you want to read more about the DC case specifically, I'm going to put a plug in for a report from 2020 published with Brian McCabe. You can see there on the right, and for all of the resources we've mentioned here, I'm happy to share a set of links at the end of this. And again, I should mention this is all pre-pandemic data. Next slide, please. All right, so the data we have in DC come from two sources. First, we received the full set of eviction filings from the DC court system. These records account for more than 160,000 eviction filings over a 5-year period in the district, including every event that took place during the life of a case as it moved through the courts. To capture information that was not included in these records, including information on the subsidy status of the tenant and the amount of rent owned, we then collected and coded more than 14,000 forms pulled from the court website with a team of research assistants. We also matched these records to property records from the office and tax revenue. Next slide, please. Just to give you a bit of context about the DC case, as with most previous work on eviction, we find that it is unequally distributed across the city. The map in green shows the share of households in a census tract that received at least one eviction filing in 2018. The neighborhoods with the highest concentration of eviction filings, 40% of renter households were impacted by the eviction process in some way. Additionally, by showing the map alongside a map of racial composition, the gray, white, and black map on the lower right-hand corner there, you can see how eviction filings are highly correlated with race and economic disparities. And I should note that these are eviction filings because that's sort of the theme of the talk here, but the patterns are the same, whether you look at eviction filings or executed evictions. All right, next slide, please. So one of the important takeaways from our research is that most eviction filings do not end in an executed eviction. We heard this from landlords in the qualitative study, and we can see it plain as day in the data. This graph indicates the number of evictions filed within the court every year between 2014 and 2018. We see only a modest changes in eviction filings. Notably, the chart also shows that only a small portion of cases filed with the court actually end up in an executed eviction. The cell is hard to see, but down at the bottom, there's sort of a slim blue line that you might have think was for aesthetic purposes. But that's the number of cases that actually end with an executed eviction, a family being removed formally from the home. And that accounts for about 5.5% of all eviction filings in the district. Where a U.S. Marshal came. Now, of course, in the green, there's a combination of the many cases in which the tenant paid the back rent, landlords who dropped the case, tenants who left voluntarily, and of course, informal and off the books evictions are part of that too. But this translates into 1 out of every 100 households in Washington, D.C. being put out of their home with a court-ordered eviction, while many others may be removed informally or leave before the writ is executed in ways that we cannot capture in the data. I should also mention that the eviction rates and the eviction filing rates were very uneven across landlords. So the top 20 landlords in the district were responsible for nearly half of all filings, but owned only 21% of total units. So as we see in our qualitative data, this massive disproportionality in terms of what types of landlords use eviction and eviction filing as a strategy and which don't. All right, next slide, please. So what we were interested in is focusing on eviction chains, by which we mean a series of evictions from the same landlord against the same tenant with no more than a 6-month gap between. And we played around a lot with different size gaps, and the findings are largely the same. These chains can vary from just a single eviction filing, sort of a chain with just one link in it, right, to filings that last over many years, chains that last over many years. We took those chains and we used a clustering algorithm called k-means clustering that basically helps us identify patterns in the different lengths, shapes, sizes of those chains of eviction to sort of produce what we call an empirical typography of eviction change in the district. Next slide, please. And the nice thing about this algorithm is that, can we move to the next slide, please? The nice thing about this algorithm is that the typography of filing chains that it came up with is fairly intuitive, which is always nice. We have the sort of most obvious filing chain, which is just a single filing, never seen before, never seen since, just sort of one isolated issue where the tenant perhaps was struggling to get rent together that month. We see a type of chain where you just have 2 filings, not back to back, but sort of spread out, 2 in a row. And then we have what we would call the serial filing change. We have moderate length chains where tenant is filed on between 3 and 6 times, but never a 6-month gap between, 7 and 16 times. And then we have very long chains that consist of more 17 largely consecutive filings against the same tenant by the same landlord. Next slide, please. And so not surprisingly, perhaps, most of the filing chains were small, right? There were these single isolated incidents. A tenant was struggling to make rent in that particular month. There was a eviction filing, and the case got resolved. Usually, we assume through back payment. That's what the qualitative data seems to suggest. But if you go to the next slide, you'll see that the actual total number of evictions were about equally concentrated between the short chains, people who were filed on just once or 2 times, and then presumably economically recovered, and these incredibly long chains. So a remarkable number, about 8,000 of the eviction filings in DC were part of these more than 17-month filing chains. Nearly 25,000 of the eviction filings were part of these 7 to 16 month long filing chains, which is quite indicative of the importance of these types of social phenomena. All right, next slide, please. What you might be tempted to think that, of course, longer chains would be more likely to end in an actual eviction, that landlord would eventually become so frustrated with the this process that they would terminate the lease, but that would actually turn out not to be the case. Largely speaking, in statistical terms, we don't see much variation in terms of the percentage of filings that end in an eviction until we get to the very long chains where we see a significant reduction in the percentage of these chains that end in eviction, right? So these are the cases where a tenant is almost always late on rent. It's always being filed upon for eviction. The landlord, of course, is collecting fees, late penalties, and so forth. And the tenant, getting back to the qualitative data, is always in the state of housing insecurity, conditional arrears, conditional housing. All right, next slide, please. So the last sort of number I'll throw at you is that we see incredible differences in the use of these long chains of filing by different types of landlords, right? So as the number of units that a landlord controls within the district increases, anything from on the left side of your graph, just 1, to having some landlords with over 5,000 units in their portfolio, the probability that any eviction they file will be part of one of these long chains increases statistically significantly and dramatically over that, right? So we have large landlords with many, many units filing for eviction frequently and habitually against tenants. And while small landlords, of course, do that at some times, they are much less likely to when compared to their larger colleagues to create these long chains. All right, last slide, please. All right, so there are 3 key conclusions that I want to leave you for. Getting back to the qualitative, we want everyone to understand eviction as a process, not just an outcome. The outcome itself is incredibly important. It is incredibly impactful on young children, on families' economic mobility to actually be forcibly evicted from a home. But for most tenants, the sort of monthly experience of the eviction system is filing and threat, which define power dynamics between landlord and tenant and have important implications for housing security and housing mobility. Our second point is that roughly half of evictions are part of serial chains. They're part of these long processes where same tenant and landlord are engaging in an eviction process anew every month or every few months for long periods. And then finally, eviction filings patterns depend on landlord strategy. Multiple landlords, large landlords, are much more likely to file on the same tenant multiple times. And now, of course, that's not necessarily a causal finding, but the association is pretty consistent across the literature. And so to us, this speaks of intentional strategic choices that some landlords are making to leverage the eviction system over and over and over again, compared to others who are more likely to file in isolated ways. Thank you so much. I will look forward to questions.
Thank you guys so much. Such incredibly comprehensive and rich data here. There are a couple of questions from the audience. One, Sarah Hasmer and Josephine McNeil asked sort of similar questions, which is about, did you look at any sort of renter protections in these communities or higher filing fees, for example, that might have discouraged landlords from filing? Did you see any difference based on those criteria?
I'll let Eva talk about the filing fees because I know she's very actively involved in that in the district.
Sure. Yeah. One of the big kind of policy levers that we thought about was filing fees. There's not a lot of research on this, and it's hard to, tell a truly causal story here. But we certainly, when we look at filing fees across the country, there is a clear descriptive association where cities and states that have lower filing fees tend to have higher eviction filing rates, at least descriptively. And so the reason for that, of course, the causal logic that could be at play here is that the burden to filing in a place like DC or in Baltimore is very, very low. It costs $15 to file in these places, or it has until very recently. And so it's very, very easy for landlords to just go ahead and file. The cost is very low to them. Conversely, it's actually interestingly much more expensive to file in the state of Texas. And so certainly this has been something that's been in the policy conversation over the past couple of years. The Maryland State Legislature has considered raising the filing fee. The DC City Council has expressed a sense of the council recommending the DC Superior Court to raise the filing fee to around $100, which is around the median filing fee across the country. And the idea there would be that, well, if it were a little bit more of a burden to file, perhaps landlords would go and talk to their tenants before they filed and maybe try to work out a payment plan, or there would be a little bit more of a buffer in there so that there weren't so many potentially frivolous suits being brought against tenants that are so harmful. That's the logic. There are drawbacks there, of course. There's always the risk that fee gets passed on to tenants. And so that's something that probably a lot of folks on this call have worked to try to prevent. But that's definitely where the conversation is at. And I think ultimately we need a lot more research to figure that out. But I think certainly the logic that we want to make it a little bit less easy for landlords to take this legal step that is so harmful to tenants might be something that would be beneficial.
Yeah, thank you for that. I see a lot of comments, rightfully reminding us of just how damaging even an eviction filing, let alone an eviction, have on renters and their ability to find housing in the future. I wanted to ask, there's so many questions in the Q&A box, we can't get to all of them, but maybe you can stay on a little bit longer and answer some questions. But I did want to ask one about the data point that you have about landlords that have a larger number of units engaging in more eviction filings. And you said it's not necessarily a causal relationship. Maybe you're looking into that further. But from your impression, is this a matter of why is it that larger scale landlords would be engaging in eviction filings as a business practice more so than maybe mom and pop tenants?
Yeah, so when we say it's not causal, that just means we haven't proven that it's causal. That doesn't mean we don't think it's causal. We absolutely, when we talk to landlords, hear very different strategic approaches articulated by the large and the small landlords, and those approaches are much more. In the large landlords, we file every month. We file on the 5th as soon as they're late, depending on your rules in your jurisdiction. And with the small landlords, there's a lot more, I try to work with them. I try to ask them for rent. I sort of hound them for 15 days, maybe 20 days, something like that. Before I start to file. I mean, in some cases, small landlords will not file for months. And of course, that's the average, right? There are plenty of small landlords who file right away. And, I think to me, it really comes down to sort of routinized professional processes that the large folks engage in, right? So these are sort of decisions that they are making consistently at a corporate level that apply to all the property managers managing in their portfolio, right? So this is something that is said on the 5th, you need to file. And honestly, filing is a very effective strategy in rent collection. It ultimately saves the landlord money to be able to file frequently and often. So it's not sort of an irrational, it's not, an angry thing. It's a very sort of practical business strategy. Small landlords often have less capacity. They have less economies of scale. Filing an eviction might be something that's new to them or something that takes more time out of their schedule. So they're more likely to resist that. They also may know their particular tenant better and be able to sort of try to approach the issue sort of idiosyncratically one-on-one. So I think that's likely what's going on here. Is this sort of the difference between a big company which has rules and a small sort of solo operator who's sort of doing what they think is best in a particular moment.
Thank you guys so much for joining. I am disheartened, of course, to hear this, to learn more about what we knew which was already true, which was that this power imbalance between landlords and renters push people into more housing instability and obviously have really long-term impacts on families and communities. So I appreciate you guys joining with us and sharing this information. There's so many questions in the Q&A box. If you're able to stay on and answer a few, we appreciate it. So thank you for joining.
Thank you for having us.
Wonderful. And now we will move on to an update from Courtney Cooperman from the National Low Income Housing Coalition on the Our Homes, Our Votes campaign. Perfect timing because the election is tomorrow, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Hi, everyone. I'm Courtney Cooperman. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a housing advocacy organizer here at NLIHC. I coordinate NLIHC's nonpartisan Our Homes, Our Votes campaign, which aims to boost voter turnout among low-income renters and their allies, and to educate candidates about housing solutions. As I'm sure you are all well aware, tomorrow is Election Day. But actually, thanks to early voting and mail-in voting, more than 40 million Americans have already voted. If you are among those 40 million, I encourage you to let us know in the chat, and thanks for being a voter. If you haven't done so already, now is the perfect time to figure out the precise details of how you'll cast your ballots later today or tomorrow. In a second, I'll share some resources that you can use to make your voting plan and some concrete actions you can take to promote voting in your community. And I love seeing this flood of comments in the chat of people who have voted already. But before I get into that, I'm just going to spend a brief minute reviewing the Our Homes, Our Votes campaign and why voting is so critical to achieving housing justice. The same communities that face the greatest barriers to securing stable, accessible, and affordable housing also face the greatest barriers to voting. Low-income people with less flexible work schedules or lack of transportation face obstacles to getting to their polling places. Polling place closures, voter purges, restrictive voter ID laws, and other voter suppression tactics disproportionately impact low-income communities and communities of color. On top of all of that, renters move more frequently than homeowners, so they face the burden of updating their voter registration more often. Because of these obstacles, homeowners turn out to vote at higher rates than renters. As you can see in the charts on the screen right now, in the 2020 presidential election, 71% of homeowners voted compared with 55% of renters, and high-income people also vote at much higher rates than low-income people. Here on the HoUSed call, we're all about talking about building the political will for bold housing solutions, and closing these voter turnout gaps is a critical piece of achieving that goal. Elected officials know who's showing up at the polls, and they're more likely to pay attention to the concerns of their constituents who vote at higher rates. The more that renters turn out to vote, the closer we get to our vision of universal, stable, affordable housing. We're so grateful to so many of you and all of our partners on the nonpartisan Our Homes, Our Votes campaign that have been working so hard to register, educate, and mobilize voters in their communities with the goal of closing this voter turnout gap. But if you haven't been involved in this work, even though the election is tomorrow, it is not too late to start. We can go on to the next slide. The first step to delivering more pro-housing voters to the polls is, of course, to make sure that you're a voter yourself. And research shows that voters are more likely to actually cast their ballots if they make a voting plan in advance. If you're among those 40 million who's already cast your ballots, don't tune out this information because you can multiply the impact of your vote by sharing resources about voting with your friends and your family members and your neighbors and making sure that they make their voting plan. One great resource for making this plan is the League of Women Voters vote411.org tool. This is a one-stop shop where you can check your voter registration status, see what's on your ballot, find your nearest polling place or ballot drop-off location, and check the hours that the polls are open. And we'll drop that link to Vote 411 in the chat. Next slide. You can also use Vote Early Days voter tool to make a voting plan and set a personalized calendar reminder to vote. Personally, if something isn't on my calendar, it doesn't exist. So if that describes you as well, then you can check out this tool and set yourself a personalized reminder to make sure that you drop off your ballot or show up at the polls tomorrow. Next slide. Transportation to the polls is another common barrier that prevents many registered voters from casting their ballots. If this is a barrier that you or anyone in your community might be encountering, you should consider taking advantage of Lyft's Election Day partnership. You can preload the code VOTE22 in the Lyft app today, and you'll get a 50% discount up to $10 on your rides to the polls. This applies to rideshare, bike share, and scooter rides. And Kim just dropped a link to some more information in the chat. Next slide. In some states, you'll need to bring a qualifying voter ID to have your vote counted. You can visit voteriders.org for some more detailed information on your state's voter ID rules. And I also put up the number for their hotline that you can call if you need any support on voter ID questions. If you're at your polling place and it turns out that you don't have the ID that the state requires, or if your eligibility is being challenged for any other reason, don't leave without casting a provisional ballot. These are ballots that are kept separately and will be counted once the voter's eligibility is determined. Depending on the state, that might require some follow-up action on the part of the voter the day after Election Day. And Kim just dropped the link to learn a little bit more about provisional balloting rules in each state. Next slide. So this brings me to another set of resources from the Nonpartisan Election Protection Coalition, which manages election protection hotlines in multiple languages. If you have questions about voting, if you see voter intimidation or misinformation, or if your right to vote is being challenged, you can call one of these hotlines, which are available in English, Spanish, and Arabic, and there's a multilingual hotline with multiple Asian languages. You can also visit 866-OUR-VOTE for more information. You might also want to spread the word about these resources on social media in case anyone in your network is encountering problems with voting. And you can use the Election Protection Coalition social media toolkit to get the word out, and we'll drop that in the chat as well. Next slide. A question that we get quite often is that people experiencing homelessness may face uncertainty about their voting rights because they don't have a permanent address to put down on a voter registration form, but people experiencing homelessness do have the right to vote. The procedure for confirming their eligibility can differ from state to state, so it's always best to check in with your local elections office. But again, the most important takeaway is that people experiencing homelessness can vote and have an important role to play in our democracy. The U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness put together a voting checklist for individuals experiencing homelessness and another checklist for service providers to help their clients vote. Next slide. Last but not least, something that you can do is encourage voting in your community by celebrating the act of voting. You can organize a walk or ride to the polls with your neighbors or host an election night watch party. You can also encourage voting by posting a selfie with your I voted sticker on social media. As you can see, I did that here. And if you're posting, use the hashtag #OurHomesOurVotes22 or tweet about why voting matters for housing justice or Facebook, Instagram, whatever social media of choice you're using. We even have a media toolkit with some sample content you can use. Next slide. In some states and cities, voters will be asked to weigh in directly on housing policy in the form of a ballot measure that would strengthen tenant protections or dedicate resources to affordable housing. NLIHC is tracking these ballot measures, so if this is something you're working on, please reach out to us. But again, whether or not there's a housing-related ballot measure in your city, keep in mind that affordable housing is always on the ballot. Whether you cast your ballot weeks ago or are still making your voting plan, voting is a key opportunity to make your voice heard for housing justice. Next slide. If you're interested in learning more about the campaign, you can visit ourhomes-ourvotes.org. And we have one more webinar in our biweekly Our Homes, Our Votes webinar series, which will focus on holding candidates accountable to their campaign promises and keeping up the momentum from nonpartisan voter engagement campaigns. and that will take place next Monday, November 14th at 2:30, and Kim just dropped the registration link. So thanks so much, everyone, and happy voting.
Thank you so much, Courtney. Just a quick question for you. You had mentioned that you're tracking housing ballot initiatives. Can you tell people, maybe give them a heads up about what your plan is for when you're tracking those, how they can get you information? And also, are there any ballot initiatives that you're particularly focused on and wanting to see what the outcome is?
For sure. Yeah, there's a lot of great ballot measures really all across the country. So if you're working on one, if you're part of a campaign, I'll drop my email in the chat. You can reach out to me. Any news articles about it would be really helpful. We want to know who's in these coalitions, how those play out. And we'll be compiling all of that information into a report that will come out in mid-December. That'll be a summary of the ballot measures and an analysis of kind of what made them successful. It's really hard to pick some out. I think there's a lot in Colorado that would they would enact a tax on short-term rentals and invest that money in affordable housing, which I think is really interesting. A lot of really great tenant protections, ballot measures in California. But yeah, it's really hard to pick them out. We're tracking over 90, and I think a lot of them are really exciting.
Thank you so much, Courtney. And I guess thank you to everybody in the audience who's been working on those ballot initiatives. And I was so heartened to see so many people who said they've already voted. And for those of you who haven't, follow Courtney's advice, do the steps you need to do today so that you can vote tomorrow. And we'll hear back from Courtney after the election to see how those ballot initiatives went. Thanks for joining with us.
Thanks.
We're going to switch gears now to hear from Sophie Seebach Glover from NLIHC, who's going to give an update on ERA spending and reallocations.
Hi, everybody. My name is Sophie Seebach Glover, and I'm going to be giving a brief overview of some new quarterly data that was recently released. Next slide. So last week, Treasury released quarterly ERA1 and ERA2 demographic data. So this data is broken down by quarter, by funding stream, and grantee. So it includes ERA1 demographic data from January 2021 through June 2022, and ERA2 demographic data from April 21 through June 2022. It has data from state, local, territorial grantees, as well as data from the Department of Hawaiian Homelands. It does not include data from tribal grantees. Just wanted to flag that for folks. Next slide. So the demographic data that was released, we see a similar trend to what we saw in 2021. About 40% of households served self-identified as Black or African American. About 20% of households served self-identified as Hispanic/Latino. About 2% of households served identified as Asian. Then about 64% of households served had extremely low incomes. If you would like to learn more about the demographic makeup of ERA recipients, the Office of Evaluation Science recently released a report comparing ERA recipients to the US renter population. And I can drop a link to that research in the chat for those who are interested. Next slide. There are several indicators beyond demographic data included in this new data. There are indicators on assistance received, application and household information, and spending. So some of the indicators regarding assistance received include average month of assistance for prospective rent and utilities. I just want to flag that it does not include rental arrears, but those forward paying rent or forward paying utilities. There is additional data on average amount of assistance provided by type of assistance. So that does include rental arrears and things like that. There's additional data on number of applications, acceptance rate, and number of households assisted by assistance type. Lastly, there are some additional spending indicators that are not included in the monthly spending data that's released. So for example, the quarterly data breaks down the amount spent on housing stability services and administrative expenses by grantee. And in this monthly spending data, this is just reported in aggregate. Next slide. As folks are exploring the data, there are just a couple things to keep in mind. If a household received assistance in 2 separate quarters, they would show up in both quarters. So for example, if a household received assistance in Q1 of 2021 and Q2 of 2022, they'd be represented in both quarters. Second, the quarterly spending data might not match the monthly spending data due to missing quarterly data. And lastly, Treasury has flagged that the application acceptance rates may need to be updated by grantees. So we encourage you to really dive in and take a look around, but those are just some things to keep in mind if you have questions. Next slide. As always, if you have any questions about ERA data, please don't hesitate to reach out at research@nlihc.org. And we're still updating our spending tracker for those who are interested, and the link is provided there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. We do have a question about whether, I think this is Treasury data, but it's okay, yes. Great. Does it include other demographic information such as disability status?
It does not. It includes race, ethnicity, gender, and then has that income component. But I don't believe grantees were asked to submit any information on disability status.
Wonderful. And I see from Barbara Fields in the chat box is letting folks know that HUD has awarded 3 different grants to different organizations to study the ERA program. So hopefully more information in the coming months will come forward so we can know more about how we can best serve households through that program. Okay, well, thank you so much, Sophie. I appreciate you joining. We're going to turn now to our field updates. We're going to hear from Brenda Clement from Housing Works. And then from Abram, we'll hear after her, Abram Diaz from Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California. Brenda? Brenda, are you able to join on or take yourself off mute? If not, we're going to go to Abram Diaz, Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California, and we'll come back to Brenda afterwards.
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Sarah. And thank you all so much for the opportunity here to discuss something we've been working on in California. For everyone, my name is Abram Diaz, Policy Director at NPH, the Nonprofit Housing Association of Northern California, and really happy to be joining you today. At NPH, we represent all major affordable housing builders and stakeholders in the Bay Area and the broader Northern California region, and work very extensively on regional and state policy matters. And so I was invited on today to talk about an initiative and a bill that we just passed this last session that you might have read about. It made some national headlines. Assembly Bill 2011 by Assemblymember Buffy Wicks, a strong housing champion and Democrat out of the Bay Area. So essentially the bill is built around a simple idea. It pairs new opportunities to build affordable housing on underutilized commercial sites with unprecedented labor standards that ensure all construction workers earn prevailing wage and receive healthcare benefits. And the reason that's such a big deal in California is we obviously have a really lengthy process for approval, something we and other urban and blue states have been wrestling with in terms of trying to address our housing crisis. And so we found a new appetite and interest at the state legislative level to pass bills out of Sacramento to apply across the state to streamline the actual production process. However, if you want to do that, you obviously have quite a few political levers you need to work through, including labor, environmental concerns, and local government concerns. And so AB 2011 is a unique vehicle to address affordable housing needs in commercial areas that we found to be particularly effective as a policy and political tool to actually move a major affordable housing streamlining bill through the state legislature. And we think it's a very good model for anyone else who's looking at this particular area in their part of the region. So to summarize the bill itself, the bill allows housing to be built in commercial areas currently zoned for office, retail, and parking uses. So really trying to make the most of any empty parking lots or office spaces, especially after the pandemic and through the remote work that might not be of great use over the following few years. And so essentially 100% affordable housing will be allowed anywhere in these commercial areas that isn't adjacent to industrial land. And we also allow for mixed income housing that has at least 15% affordable units if they're along commercial corridors. So really trying to take advantage of these large commercial areas for the construction of housing, really trying to ensure that we have jobs, housing next to major job centers in urban areas. So through some research on our end, AB 211 is going to free up about 108,000 acres of transportation corridor adjacent land for affordable housing and mixed income residential development. In exchange for us to be able to actually move this forward, we did have to work very closely with union partners, and we're going to be paying developers who work within these bills prevailing wage for workers for projects of 50 units or more, healthcare benefits for workers, which is a pretty unprecedented step in the affordable housing space. And then we're also going to be prioritizing the use of apprenticeship programs and using apprentices on the job so we can train up the future generations and cohorts of workers to be working on affordable housing projects. And so based on current market conditions, we're expecting AB 2011 could increase the state's capacity of market feasible housing development by about 1.6 to 2.4 million homes. We ran these studies about the summer of, just a few months ago. And addition to opening new sites to 100% affordable housing, this bill has the potential to produce as many as 300 to 400,000 income restricted affordable homes that require no government subsidy. So that's the summary of the bill itself, trying to prioritize and partner commercial development in areas that we think are very opportune. What strikes us as particularly effective from us on the advocate end was the diverse set of stakeholders able to come together around a bill that's focused on promoting jobs and housing in infill areas. We were able to work with, of course, our usual affordable housing partners. California Housing Consortium, and particularly was a lead sponsor of the bill. But we were also able to engage with union folks who normally, aren't always perhaps on our side, and we had to find a way to work with them, as well as certain environmental actors who found that the commercial focus of the streamlining was of particular importance to them, as well as with a subset of local elected officials. So I'll mention in brief here, working with union partners was really important for us, especially in California. We'd had a big impasse on affordable housing measures over the last 3-4 years. And so we worked closely with a subsector of practical partners, including SEIU, who represent a lot of healthcare workers and janitor workers, and they don't work in the housing space. They simply wanted to see some progress in the housing area so that their workers would have somewhere to live. Then we also worked with the School Employees Association, and finally, the California carpenters who, as we imagine, are going to be working quite a lot of these jobs. In the environmental space, we made some new inroads with Greenbelt Alliance and the Greenlining Institute. And in the local government space, we worked very closely with mayors out of Oakland, Richmond, other parts of the Bay Area and Southern California, some big city players who are already doing a lot of streamlining of construction in commercial areas. And so being able to take their piece and expand it across the state created a bit of an avenue to actually get local government support for this bill, when normally they'd be at least worried, if not politically opposed to these measures. So to summarize here, our key advocacy pitch was that this simple measure, streamlining the construction of affordable housing in commercial areas, would address multiple major policy issues at once: the affordable housing crisis, the homelessness crisis, issues of traffic, environmental issues by reducing vehicle miles traveled, and economic issues as well. Can we bring homes closer to job centers that would support the work of our major employers in the state and in these urban areas? When we were actually able to move this bill forward, and the key part of it was finding a labor deal, and that includes the wage, the healthcare, the apprentices, that was acceptable for major union parties, the bill moved through the governor's desk. Governor Gavin Newsom proudly signed it in San Francisco. And the infill housing area was just very powerful. It earned us a lot of rural and suburban votes, environmental votes, and pro-business votes that normally can be really difficult for us to find in the state legislature here in California. And for our next steps over the next few years, we're going to see if we can apply this labor framework perhaps to other bills, and also see what kind of technical improvements we need to create for AB 2011 as the bill rolls out in June, and will be on the books until a sunset 10 years from now. So at some point, I imagine we'll have to extend the bill or make it a permanent aspect of California law. And so that was a major initiative we took on. Would absolutely love to, answer any questions if I can on this bill. And I hope that it'll be a model for other states, as other states have been a model for us on ways we can address the affordable housing crisis on a state-by-state level. So yeah, thank you, Sarah.
Thank you. Abram, what a huge success you had. I mean, it's amazing. I think it really points to how powerful cross-sector partners are, working with people outside, not just housers, but people who focus on other issues too. And I love the idea of including apprenticeships into the model. I'm wondering, is there any consideration about who might be eligible for those apprenticeships? Is it possible that low-income people who might be the beneficiaries of the affordable housing could take part in that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in actually working as one of the sponsors with the California Carpenters, who run a lot of apprentice programs themselves, they have a lot of leverage and authority over who is able to apply to work within their programs. So the bill does not specify in terms of who will be in the apprentice program or not, but we know the partners that we had and the labor partners we had at the table work very directly to ensure that these are available to folks who are low income and oftentimes people of color. And just to wrap on that point, part of the reason we really emphasize the need to use apprentices and not perhaps take it a step too far in terms of limiting our workforce to only fully skilled and trained workers is that achieving that status can be, take time, it's difficult, especially when we're in an affordable housing crisis, when we want to ensure our workers get there. And so if you focus more on the front end and training folks up and actually getting them hours on the job, you can expand the workforce. And in doing so, make really quality, high level job opportunities available to folks who, are in need in these urban areas. So overall, just really exciting. And we are hopeful that over the next few years, as we report out the numbers of construction, we'll prove it's a very workable model in this state and hopefully others as well.
It's so wonderful from that point of view. You mentioned training people, giving them opportunities for more income. It's also really important because one of the consistent challenge is that we just don't have enough workers who are in the construction trades, and that also contributes to the affordable housing crisis. So you're sort of hitting it from two different angles. So I really appreciate the creativity there, and thank you so much for joining with us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much for having us.
Absolutely. I'm going to turn now to Brenda Clement from Housing Works from Rhode Island, and I'll turn it to you, Brenda.
Hi, Sarah. Nice to see you, and glad to be here with a number of colleagues. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, you sound great.
Okay, great. Well, thank you again for the opportunity. Just a quick overview. Housing Works Rhode Island is a research and policy organization housed at Roger Williams University, a private university here in Rhode Island. And we, through our documents and through our report, particularly our annual housing factbook report, we try to show the connectedness between housing and economic growth and development, but also in health and educational outcomes for our residents and our citizens. We just released our annual fact book, and as we know from a lot of the data from a lot of other states, there's a lot of bad news in that data. Right now in Rhode Island, for the second year in a row, there is no municipality where the median household income of $70,000 could affordably buy, and only one municipality where the median renter income of $38,000 plus could affordably rent. We have not simply as our fact book has shown for many, many years, have just not been producing enough housing at all income levels, but particularly for lower wage workers. Another alarming figure from our perspective is that nearly 70% of the jobs identified as high growth occupations in Rhode Island do not pay an hourly housing wage as identified by NLIHC. So, again, as we point out through lots of our documents, this is a workforce development, but also retention issue, and then has huge impacts, as we all know, on health and educational outcomes and attainment and achievement. So despite all of the doom and gloom, though, I think, that we have a fair amount to celebrate. One is that we have, for the first time, gotten received and are receiving a lot of both media attention, but also political attention on issues and problems. Many people, including our House leadership and our state House of Representative, has made housing a priority item and has moved through a series of bills last session and is working with housing advocates like us on a series of other bills, and is also willing to dive into details around zoning and land use. And so the work in California and other places across the country have been hugely helpful for us as well too. Most of what we land use and zoning in Rhode Island and in the New England region is challenging and difficult. A lot of it is still very town and city municipality centric. We don't have regional governments per se. And so it's a challenging environment to try to shift. But now for the first time, we've got serious interest in looking at how can we make changes to zoning ordinances, how can we repurpose existing properties, and how can we make sure that we're using these changes to target people most in need. So I mean, I'm preaching to the choir here, but we all knew well before the pandemic that zip code mattered. And now it is very clear post-pandemic that it matters even more. And so trying to create opportunities in all of the zip codes across our state is part of what we're hoping to focus on. I will also do a shout out, as you know, we also, as some of my colleagues who are state partners, we got a pretty big lion's share of our federal dollars allocated towards housing and the ARPA funds. So it's the biggest investment that we've had for a long, long time in housing. It's all federal dollars. Our state investment into housing is still relatively small, but it's giving us some opportunities to do some exciting things over the next couple of years. But as we know, money's great and it's a big part of the solution, but it's not the only part of the solution. And so look forward to hearing more from colleagues about as we dive in deeper on land use and zoning as well. And Sarah, I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions or talk as time permits.
Yeah, I'm curious. You mentioned that some of your big champions are focused on zoning. When you've been engaging with them or maybe they're hearing from the public about the need for housing, I assume, what are the sorts of messages that have been most resonant with your elected officials?
So, I mean, our House Speaker has been, and the committee members, he's a land use attorney, so that helps a lot. He understands the lingo and understands the language as well, too. I think people, when we start to point out to individual representatives and legislators, things that we consider kind of iconic neighborhoods and communities in our state, and point out to them that those could not be rebuilt under existing zoning ordinances that have now been put in place for a lot of reasons, the light bulb goes on, and people start to say, wow, what do you mean we couldn't do this now? I said, you can do it, but you have to do it through 40 million exemptions and go through a long process at zoning board and fight every neighbor that comes out who opposes your variance or your parking variance or whatever you're asking for. So I think trying to make it clear, and tying it to specific sites and specific neighborhoods as to why this needs to happen, and tying it into populations that makes sense. If people want to age in place or age in community, they need those kinds of options and choices. And in Rhode Island and New England, I mean, we have great examples of how we used to connect housing and transportation and jobs together. And you only have to look at mill villages and mill housing around. And while the mill complex or the mill housing complex had its faults as well too, that connectedness between those jobs and transportation and housing are a good model for us to try to replicate and build. And you simply can't do that anymore, that level of density under existing zoning. So our peak of building in Rhode Island was in the mid 80s when we were producing about 7,500 building permits a year. I know that's minuscule from California and other states. For the last 10 plus years, we have had seen a little over 1,000 building permits per year. So we have simply not been building enough at all income levels, but particularly, as we know from the data, for those at very low income, we have a lot of catch up to do.
Can you share you mentioned that the ARPA funds that Congress passed that you're looking forward to using that for some exciting projects? Are there any in mind that you can share with us?
The money has all gone out to RFP, and projects are coming in and have been evaluated. A lot of it is focused on production and producing new units, preserving existing housing as well too. There is also money in ARPA that an RFP that's just out for right to counsel statewide. Providence had used some of their ARPA funds the city of Providence had used some of their ARPA funds to do a citywide program, but this RFP would allow it to go out to statewide, which would be a great thing. And then there's some small home repair dollars, some healthy housing dollars. And so there's a wide variety of needs being met by this, but and again, it's 250 million, which again is a lot of money and a lot of money in Rhode Island. But our estimates are that our shortage is about $1 billion plus. So, it's a good down payment, but it's definitely not the end.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for joining with us, Brenda. It's always good to see you.
Same here. Glad to see you. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Great. And now we will move along. I'll give a Hill update. Next slide. So many of you guys may be aware we have an election tomorrow, and lots of folks on the Hill have been watching to see what happens tomorrow. That's going to have a huge impact on what's possible, both in the lame duck session through the end of the year, but also next year. So we're starting to plan ahead for what that means. I'll just give you guys a heads up that the next time we meet, we'll have much more information about how the election came out, and we can share with you sort of a preview of what we think what we think might be ahead for us in 2023. But for now, I'm going to focus on the 2 legislative opportunities that we have between now and the end of the year. The first is with trying to get a final FY23 spending bill. You may remember that we are currently operating under what's called a continuing resolution. That's just a way for Congress to kick the can down the road, give themselves a little bit more time to make decisions about spending. It's very common. We see it all the time. In fact, I think every year for the last at least 12 years, we've seen a CR. So we're hoping that after the election, members of Congress will turn their attention back to negotiating over a final spending bill. And there is a lot at stake. And so there's a lot of reasons for you to weigh in with your members of Congress. First, the thing you should know is that the House bill that would provide funding for housing programs is about $3 billion more than the Senate version. And so it's important that we're going out and talking about why we need as many resources as possible. And one way that we see that play out between the House and Senate bill is that the House bill includes enough funding not only to renew all existing vouchers, but to expand rental assistance to another 140,000 households. The Senate bill, on the other hand, would serve up to 5,000 households, which is not nearly where we need it to be. Next slide. Next slide, too. So between now and the end of the year, and I'd say sooner rather than later, you're going to want to call all of your members of Congress. That includes both Democrats and Republicans, but especially if you have members who are on either the House or Senate appropriations committees. There's a lot of concern. While I think many congressional leaders want to be able to pass a final spending bill in December, there is some fear, especially coming out of the election, if House Republicans have a particularly good night for them, that there may be pressure on them to either continue to have a continuing resolution through the new year, so that could allow the incoming Congress to push for lower spending, both for housing and for other programs. So the first message has to be that we have to pass a spending bill this year. We can't afford to kick the can to next year at all. But second, that we want to make sure that housing programs receive the highest level of funding possible. All of these spending bills require 60 votes in the Senate. So that means that both Democrats and Republicans are needed to get this through. So don't just focus your effort on one, focus on both and get that message across. We do have a national sign-on letter that you can join. I believe we're up at maybe 1,800, maybe more organizations that have signed on to the letter in support of the highest level of funding possible. This is a great time for you to sign on if you haven't. We've been sending the letter periodically to Hill staff, but we want to make sure that we're sending something to them as quickly as possible after the election, so that when they're going into the negotiating room, they are hearing from you about why housing is important. Next slide. The second opportunity this year is a tax extenders package. It is possible that Congress will pass a tax extenders package, which is really a way for them to continue tax provisions that expire, but it's also an opportunity to go further than that and to add additional resources, particularly for the low-income housing tax credit. So it's really important that we're talking to our members of Congress about why the LIHTC is an important resource, but also talk about the reforms that are needed to better serve people who are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. All of you know that LIHTC is really the primary source of financing for affordable housing, but on its own, it's often not enough to build homes or preserve homes that are affordable to people with the lowest incomes. And we need to make sure that any expansion that happens this year benefits people who need housing the most. Next slide. Just as a reminder, this is some of our data from our annual GAP report. Again, it shows that the greatest shortage of affordable housing comes from extremely low-income renters. Until and unless we're addressing their housing needs, we'll continue to have a housing crisis. And so it's important that we're using every single opportunity to expand resources that we need, to better target resources that exist. And the tax extenders bill is just one way to do it. Next slide. And this is a reminder, every state has a severe shortage of housing for people with the lowest incomes. This is not new to you. I'm sure you've seen in your own communities just how many extremely low-income renters are struggling to pay rent. Next slide. So there are a couple of reforms that we think are most important in this conversation about tax extenders. We want to make sure that any package that expands LIHTC also includes providing an expanded basis boost for developments that set aside at least 20% of their units to be affordable to extremely low-income renters. And we want to see a set aside of 8% of all LIHTC resources specifically for that purpose. Interesting. That those expanded basis boosts and that set aside of resources will make it easier for developers to build housing that's affordable to people with the lowest incomes. Now, I'll say this is not a panacea. It's not the end all be all of what is going to result in more housing for people with the lowest incomes. We know that we need things like universal rental assistance, more money for public housing, for the Housing Trust Fund, but it's important that we're using any legislative vehicle to make changes that are needed. Next slide. We also want to make sure that rural and tribal communities are better able to access the low-income housing tax credit. And so we also are proposing designating those communities as difficult to develop, and that would make them automatically eligible for a 30% basis boost, again, making it a little bit more easy for those developments to come together and happen. Next slide. There are other reforms that we think are important, so I'll just quickly touch on them as well. We want to see an elimination of the qualified contract loophole that investors use to get out of their affordable housing restrictions. We want to make sure that we are strengthening the right of first refusal for nonprofits to take over ownership of properties. We want to share more data between HUD and IRS so we know which properties are at risk of leaving the portfolio, putting renters at risk of seeing their rents increase. And we want more renter protections for residents who are living in LIHTC properties. Next slide. So again, the timing on this is the same as the appropriations bill between now and the end of the year. I think after this, what I've heard is after the election, we'll have a better sense of what is possible and the scope of what a tax bill could look like. So for now, it's important that you're engaging with all of your members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans. Again, this is a bill that would require 60 votes in the Senate. So it's important that you're hitting both folks from both parties. But if you have a member of Congress who's on the Senate Finance Committee or the House Ways and Means Committee, you have an important job ahead, because these are the folks who are going to be drafting that tax legislation. And we want to make sure that they are prioritizing people with the greatest needs. Next slide. We have lots of resources that you can use, talking points, fact sheets, budget charts. Check it out. We're going to share this PowerPoint with you guys after today's call, so you can use those resources in your advocacy. Next slide. And last time I asked you guys to take out your phones. I'm going to ask you to do it again. Use your camera or whatever QR code reader to use this QR code to bring up, it brings up our website and ways for you to take action. It's very simple to use. The last time we had this call, we had about 40 people participate. This week, I want to see 60 people participate. So please take out your phones, do a little multitasking, use it to go to our Take Action website and weigh in with Congress directly from that website on appropriations issues, on the tax extenders issue, and all of our other policy priorities. We're going to leave that slide up for now, but I want to thank everybody for joining today's call. We will see you in 2 weeks and look forward to engaging with you guys. Thanks so much.